Welcome to a Peskotomuhkati Lodge Talk. This Lodge Talk with Paul Williams, negotiator. There's a framework agreement in the offing. Tell me what a framework agreement is.
When the Government of Canada agrees to negotiate, and it's been called comprehensive claims with an Indigenous nation, that is, with people who've never given up any land before, which is the case in all of Atlantic Canada, the first thing Canada does is require an agreement about process. That's what a framework agreement does, is set up the rules for how the negotiations are going to happen.
So it's sort of like negotiating an agreement about how you negotiate.
Precisely.
What's in this one?
What's in this one? This one starts with a recognition that there's a treaty relationship and moves from there to showing how the existing relationship between the Crown and the Peskotomuhkati Nation will guide ongoing negotiations as part of a process that has existed for 2.5 centuries. This agreement sets out where negotiations will happen, how often they will happen, and mainly it sets a menu for what we are going to talk about that will end up in a final accord. It also says some things, because the negotiations will go on for years, some things we can negotiate on an interim basis. It contemplates what happens if negotiations break down. It talks about how we resolve concerns before they become disputes, and that's about it.
Is this a common approach? Because when we watch the news about land claims or negotiations, usually we're hearing that they're breaking down, but we don't hear about framework agreements. Is this common?
The framework agreement is common. The breakdown occurs when people are talking about substance rather than process. What we've tried to do in this particular instance is set up an extension of an existing relationship that has safeguards against a breakdown. So we don't know whether, when we get into substance, we are going to have the same kind of progress. But this framework agreement took 2 years to negotiate, whereas, for example, the Mi'kmaq-Maliseet agreement in New Brunswick or the Mi'kmaq agreement in Nova Scotia took 10 years to negotiate. Why are we so quick? Partly because we're dealing with the Trudeau government instead of the Harper government, partly because we built on what other people have done, partly because, frankly, we're good at what we do.
What's unique about this one other than the speed with which it was done?
Taking advantage of advances in law and advances in policy and politics to say, this is being done in 2 legal systems, this is being done with the intention of actually implementing treaties. We're willing to take the risk to do it right instead of backing away and creating interim agreements that hedge the bets. In some ways, this looks a lot like what other people have done. In some ways, this is a little bold.
It's really powerful to see the name of the chief on the cover of the framework agreement in equal footing and status as 2 ministers of the Crown.
That's something that's a fundamental principle that we've gone with, is reciprocity or equality. These are nations coming together. The Maori say we stand eye to eye. If it's a negotiator signing an agreement, I'm that negotiator's counterpart. If it's the chief, it's at least a minister on the other side.
And even more remarkable seems to be the recognition of the Peskotomuhkati law and history and culture within this negotiation process.
That's recent. I mean, the Royal Commission report, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, recommended that in 1994, and nothing happened. The calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada recommended it 3 years ago. Court decisions have recognized Indigenous legal systems and have said that reconciliation is, how do you reconcile 2 peoples, 2 legal systems, 2 systems of government in one place? So we're actually doing what Canadian law requires, and Canadian politicians have been slow to come to, but we've also pushed in this agreement mutual recognition. You'll see when you read through the agreement that clause after clause says, Canada has laws, we have laws, Canada has decision makers, we have decision makers. One of the things about this agreement, for example, is we've insisted that it be in all 3 languages. In French, partly because New Brunswick is bilingual and we have Acadian friends and allies, and we respect that. But we also insist that in this International Year of Indigenous Languages, and with an Indigenous Languages Act before Parliament, until Parliament prorogued, yes, there should be respect for language, and respect for law, and respect for culture, and it's within that atmosphere of mutual respect that's treaty-based that the negotiations happen.
Now, for non-lawyers, the law is complex. For most people, including lawyers and courts, and even judges have said this, Indigenous law and relations is really complex. This document recognizes not only the different legal and cultural systems, but they have all changed over time. That makes it even more complex. Talk about that for a second.
It is. Wabanaki law, that is Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, Peskotomuhkati, Penobscot, the 4 nations. Of course their legal systems have evolved since contact with Europeans, in fact collision with Europeans. Of course they have adapted over time. One of our problems is that we're dealing with federal lawyers who say, we don't know your law. And we say, hey, welcome to where we were in 1725. What it comes down to, and what we've been able to make progress on, is to be able to say, we're not insisting on the details, we're insisting on the principles. And we can explain the principles, and the principles are things that we can mutually accept and build on.
What are the big ones we should think of when we think of Indigenous law having an effect on these negotiations?
Okay, let me distinguish first, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission does this. It says there's Aboriginal law, which is Canada's laws about Aboriginal peoples. There's Indigenous law or Indigenous legal systems, which are different from nation to nation, and which come from those nations and their cultures. So really in these negotiations, we're talking about how do 2 legal systems, different nations, this is international law, I think that's probably a beginning point, and how do these 2 legal systems use their existing treaty relationship, which is recognized in the Constitution of Canada as the hinge that allows those 2 legal systems to meet and coexist. And really the treaty relationship begins with 2 very different cultures being in the same territory and being compatible. That is, in the 1700s, there were small British settlements, agricultural and fishing villages, and the Peskotomuhkati had a much lighter footprint on a much more extensive territory. And they weren't incompatible. How do we restore that incompatibility after a couple of centuries in which the Crown basically ignored its obligations? And the first principle, and I should say in 1766, the covenant chain relationship was extended to the East, and the 3 fundamental principles there, and there's an order to them, are respect, trust, and friendship. And I've had it explained to me by some of the older chiefs that there's an order there because you don't trust somebody you don't respect. You can't be friends with somebody you don't trust. So we are talking about restoring, and this is the Prime Minister's mandate letter to various ministers, restoring respectful nation-to-nation relations. How do we do that? We start with acknowledging that there's a nation there.
But what is remarkable for people to just in passing watch television and think of the union management labor negotiations they see, or threatened strike, or school teachers or nurses or anyone, they think of it as confrontational. And we don't really think of those parties deciding to have a respectful relationship and codifying it in agreement before they begin negotiations. I mean, this is a whole other approach, isn't it?
A lot of North American Anglo culture is based on the thinking of British government. And in the House of Commons, the government's benches and the opposition benches are literally 2 sword lengths apart, so they can't injure each other. And the nature of the relationship that makes the government work is that the opposition wants to become the government one day and is a loyal opposition. Well, the nature of the treaty relationship is it's a family relationship. We have become brothers, which signifies an equality, but it signifies an affection. There's a respectful distance, so we don't interfere with each other, but the affection keeps us close. What it does is the fundamental question when somebody brings forth a concern or an issue, the obligation on the other side is not to test it or oppose it, but to say, how can we help you? And that's right there in the treaty relationship. So it does make for a different atmosphere. The question is, how do we get there in 21st century Canada?
Well, the other question is, how can you convince other negotiators in labor and management and teachers and nurses disputes to try that? But that's a bigger topic, perhaps.
And the only way you do that is by showing that it works.
Tell me the importance of wampum records.
Okay. Wampum is shell beads made from purple quahog clam shells, white whelk shells. I've got a wampum bracelet here. Its origin in law comes from a ceremony of deep compassion where one person consoles another one over the grief and sorrow of the death of relatives. And that's what you do as brothers, as equals, is you raise up somebody's mind when his mind is cast down or grieving. It's the most profound act of respect and compassion between individuals. That gets extrapolated to the nation level, and from there it becomes a means of preserving commitments. Shell doesn't burn or get soggy or deteriorate like paper, so it's a form of keeping records. It's just as much a record of a treaty as the paper document would be a record of a treaty, but it has a limited range of expression. It's symbolic and it's mnemonic, that is, it assists memory. And it's uniquely suited for cultures that operate on memory and tradition rather than putting things in paper. The other thing it does, and I like to explain this, is that we tend to put important values and important concepts in stories rather than in laws, rather than in detailed laws. That a people who are non-literate or who don't rely on writing very much, if they all share the same story, that's even more powerful than if it's put in a law book somewhere.
I'd like to read a quote from this document because it seems remarkable to me, as a lot of aspects of it are remarkable. Canada recognizes that it will have to go beyond the limits of existing policy on comprehensive claims. Now again, if the analogy were labor management relations, you can't imagine one side saying, we're going to do things that we've never done before and make concessions or make things work in a new and unique way. That's a pretty powerful commitment, isn't it?
It looks that way at first. Canada's policy on comprehensive claims came out in 1973, was revised in the 1990s, and frankly, we can't tell right now whether there is an existing policy or whether it is the policy. I'm not kidding. 2 months ago, one of the federal negotiating teams said, our policy is that we have no policy. So the policy isn't so much a shambles as a recognition that there are principles to be met and that the past policy has not resulted in the kind of recognition of self-determination, treaty relations, nation-to-nation relations that the present government aspires to.
Now,
there's uncertainty there rather than reassurance there. We don't know how much of a change there's going to be.
Now, in just some fairness to that quote, perfectly reasonable for governments not to have a policy on a particular matter or to change it over time. And some people say policy is what a minister says, what's codified somewhere, or what is habitual behavior. So policy is kind of a movable feast, isn't it?
3 months ago, we discovered that the table we've been at for 2 years is something Canada calls a recognition and implementation of self-determination table. It turns out that there are now 80 such tables across the country. We didn't know we were one of them. Is there a policy? We've never seen it. What's it supposed to do? It's supposed to be flexible. It's supposed to allow us to use imagination. Of course, we welcome that. The question is, what are the rules? At least one of the rules is we're not going to be asked to have rights extinguished. We're going to work together to define, clarify, and add meaning to the rights. So that's positive.
There's another positive thing, and that is the parties have agreed to keep what they talk about confidential, or without prejudice, as lawyers like to say. So it seems to me that means you can float an idea, even one that won't work, see how it sounds when you say it, see what the other parties say about it, and then if anything ever goes to court or is the subject of some other kind of dispute, you can't use it.
It gives us freedom in the negotiations. It takes a while for negotiators on all sides to develop the confidence in one another to actually be able to float ideas. What we've been seeking to do over the past 2 or 3 years is put forward ideas that and in the treaty tradition, certainly in every tradition I'm familiar with, Wabanaki, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, there are actually tenses in the indigenous language that don't exist in English that allow you to express hopefulness, express tentativeness, rather than throw people on their back. So you're asking them to think about something, but you're able to express that powerfully enough that they realize you're not just putting out a tentacle, you're really serious about this. What it's done over time, now that we have federal and provincial negotiators who are confident that we can actually talk about things without them going public, and these negotiations have been relatively quiet, is we're able to use our imagination more, we hope. Sometimes we encounter people who are much more inflexible, and the frustration comes when the inflexibility is, for example, it's a cabinet policy. We can't tell you what it is because cabinet documents are confidential, but we can tell you we can't tell you. Well, at that point, you wonder why you're doing this. But generally speaking, the confidentiality means we have flexibility. Our challenge comes when we get to a point where we have to account to the people and we have to tell them what's happening. And so far, we've had the advantage of not negotiating through the media and not having so many people engaged directly in the negotiations that we lose track.
So many more things to talk about: health, well-being, the environment, fisheries, water, etc. But for now, that's what we focused on was the framework agreement and why it exists. Is there anything else you'd like to add on that specific topic?
The next thing, once the framework agreement is in place, is actually sitting down and setting priorities. At the same time, we're still looking to Canada to keep the promise made by Minister Andy Scott in 2005 of recognizing the people as a band and the people as status Indians, because that means they're going to get education help, health care, housing, economic development that they've been denied by not being recognized under the Indian Act. So that's a separate path, but it's an important one. At the same time, setting priorities, both land and protecting land are huge priorities. An economic base for a people who've been marginalized in a province that's been marginalized, that's important. At a time of environmental crisis, participating in making things right, that's important. Those are priorities. We haven't made any secret of those.
Now, I happen to know personally that you've spent, I guessed incorrectly one time, but probably 10,000 hours or more on this particular file. And this is the culmination of 13 years of an enormous amount of work. And if I guessed a little low on the hours, sorry, but congratulations.
Appreciate it. Thank you. It's a major step. We hope that the framework agreement is a doorway. It's a one-way doorway. That is, there's no going back.
Any views expressed in this Lodge Talk don't necessarily reflect the views of any citizens of the Passamaquoddy Nation, its employees, friends, or neighbors. The object is stimulating conversation. Please go to the web, social media, email, or the telephone to join in the Lodge Talk.